Thank you everybody for coming. Appreciate. Sorry the fact there was a Zoom problem. But what I want to do today, I want to study together with everybody. I want to ask the following question, and that is, what's the mitzvah of Shavuot? What does that mean? What's the mitzvah of Shavuot? Shavuos is the day we commemorate the receiving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. Now, maybe that in itself is what Shavuos is. It's a day of commemoration. Pesach, we commemorate the Exodus from Egypt. Sukkot, we commemorate the 40 years of travel in the desert. So Shavuos, we commemorate the receiving of the Torah. And that is what it is. That is a commemoration, and it's a commemorative holiday. The thing is that in Judaism, we're big on ritual. Ritual meaning to do something, an action, or at least to fulfill some kind of positive commandment in everything we do. So on Pesach, it's not enough just to remember the Exodus, but we eat matzah, we eat maror, and we have the same. On Sukkot, we have a sukkah, and we have a lulav, and all those things. On Shavuos, we don't have anything. That's in itself a very interesting thing. I know we have cheesecake, but we don't really have anything. And that's kind of a problem with Shavuos. Why is there no ritual or mitzvah or commandment or something that's connected with Shavuos? So the technical answer to that question is that Shavuos is really the culmination of Pesach. That really Sfirat HaOmer is the countdown from Pesach to Shavuot, and that we got out of Egypt only so we would receive the Torah. So the rituals we took care of 7 weeks ago. And actually the Ramban in Chumash says that the 7 weeks of Sfirat HaOmer are almost like a Chol HaMoed. And this is the end of the holiday of Pesach. That's kind of an interesting thing to think about Shavuot as being the end of the holiday of Pesach. I'll just point out something which is kind of interesting for trivia buffs. Since you came on, I'll tell you something that for trivia buffs. We observe 2 days of every holiday in Chutz La'aretz, in the diaspora. Why do we do that? We do that because in the time where they declared the new month based on the sighting of the moon. And by the way, you should know that the Muslims still do it that way. They were waiting. Ramadan ended only when the new moon was seen in Saudi Arabia, I guess in Mecca, this past week. So it's interesting, they still have it. So therefore, since word didn't get out to the diaspora in time, so they observed 2 days of the holiday, 2 days of Yontif, right? Because we don't know if the moon was seen on day X, meaning the 30th day of the previous month or the 31st day of the previous month. So therefore, we observe 2 days of Yontif. Okay, that's true for Pesach. That's true for Sukkot. Rosh Hashanah is a little funny because Rosh Hashanah is the first day of the month. So therefore, Rosh Hashanah, even in Israel, is 2 days, because it was, even in Israel, you had that problem of people not knowing exactly when Rosh Hashanah was. The Rambam asks the following question. Shavuos, what's the date of Shavuos? So I'm sure you all know the fact that the Torah does not give a date for Shavuos. The Torah does not give a date for Shavuos. The Torah tells us that at the end of Sfiras HaOmer, there are 49 days of Sfiras HaOmer. On the 50th day, we celebrate the holiday of Shavuos. It's also interesting that the Torah doesn't directly connect the holiday of Shavuos with receiving the Torah, but that's not for us. The idea is that on the 50th day, we celebrate the holiday of Shavuos. The question is like this. Why do we need a second day of Yontif? It means I understand that it takes 2 weeks, and in 2 weeks the people in Babylonia or Persia or wherever they lived didn't get the word yet on when Rosh Chodesh was, then when Yontif was. But come on, everybody. By the time, 50 days had passed Everybody knew when Yontif was. They could have gone around the world, right? Even in the old days, they could have gone around the world in 50 days and told them when Yontif was. So why is it that there's a second day of Shavuos? Why don't we just say that Shavuos is different? That Shavuos is not based on its own counting in the calendar, but rather Shavuos is based on 50 days from Pesach. From 50 days after Pesach, everybody would know when Pesach was, right? But and just to make that point a stronger point, we don't do something which we could in theory do. So we have 2 days of Pesach, right? Means we don't know if we have two Seders. We don't know if it's the first Seder or the second Seder. At the second Seder, we count the first night of Sfirat Omer, correct? Today's the first day of Sfirat Omer. Hayom Yom Echad LaOmer. Now, my problem is like this. If it's true that the first day of Pesach is not what we call the first day of Pesach, but the first day of Pesach is really the second day of Pesach, well then Sfiras HaOmer is all wrong, because Sfiras HaOmer does not begin when we count Sfiras HaOmer, it begins a night later. And the question that everybody asks is, why don't we, for 49 days, count Hayom Shnei Yomim LaOmer, Hayom Yom Echad LaOmer? Why don't we count two possibilities? Today is either day number 2 in Sfiras Omer or day number 1 in Sfiras Omer. Last night also, by the way, last night was 49 days in Sfiras Omer. Maybe, because if it turns out that the second Seder was really the right time for Pesach, then last night was not the 49th day of Sfiras Omer. Tonight is the 49th day of Sfiras Omer, right? And therefore, Shavuos doesn't start till tomorrow night. So that's a good question. First of all, that's a good question. Why don't we count like that? So you tell me, everybody, it's only us on the screen, so you can tell me, why is it that we don't count Sfiras Omer that way? Why don't we say today is the 49th day of Sfiras Omer, today is the 48th day of Sfiras Omer? Why don't we do it that way? Anybody know? Why don't we do it that way? It's not a halachic answer. What's the answer? Rabbi Soloveitchik actually gives this answer. What's the answer? The answer, of course, is that you can't count that way. How old are you? I'm either 38 or 39. No, you're not. I asked you how old you are. So tell me how old you are. When you count, counting has to be absolute. Now, it can be wrong, right? I mean, sometimes you count and you count wrong. You ask me how old I am. I tell you I'm 38. That's not the truth. But I can tell you I'm 38 or 39. That's not what we call counting. So therefore, they had to make a decision when it came to Sfiras HaOmer that Sfiras HaOmer was going to be one day, and that we were going to take, the second day of Pesach, and that was going to be the beginning of Sfiras HaOmer. Another reason why tonight is Shavuos. That's it, right? Tomorrow night's not Shavuos because last night we counted 49 days of Sfiras HaOmer, not tonight. So therefore, tonight begins the day of Shavuos, and Shavuos is only one day. That actually is a good question. Sometimes, my father would always tell you, right? Sometimes there are, right, Deborah, you said, my father would say, what do you think? So sometimes, there's a klutz kasha. That's fair also, right? He would say that's a klutz kasha. Klutz kasha means you're just making trouble, right? It's not really a question. But this is actually a question about Shavuos. Number one is, the counting, right? We count it as if there's only one day of Shavuos. And number two is that whole complicated system of telling everybody when Shavuos was. By now you would know. The Rambam says the following, and this is interesting. The Rambam says the reason we have 2 days of Shavuos is because since we have 2 days of all the other holidays, so therefore we have 2 days of Shavuos. Mipnei takanat hamoadot. Because that's just the way it was done. And therefore, we have 2 days of Shavuos, even though we don't really need to have 2 days of Shavuos. Now, that also, you talk about what my father would like. He likes that also. That's the way you run a system, a halachic system. The system is there are always 2 days of Yontif, right? There are always 2 days of Yontif. Don't tell me this holiday has 2 days of Yontif, this holiday doesn't have 2 days of Yontif. That's too complicated. There are 2 days of Yontif. Every holiday has 2 days of Yontif. Now, the truth of the matter is that that's not exactly right for two reasons. Number one is in Israel, they observe 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, but not 2 days of any other holiday. According to that argument in the Rambam, that probably would be no good, right? So I'm going to get to you, Rabbi Herzl, I'll get to you in 1 second. And you have a better kasha about Yom Kippur, right? So actually, so in Israel, they have just 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. But leave that aside for a minute. The Rambam didn't live in Israel. But my question is like this. We don't have 2 days of Yom Kippur. Why don't we have 2 days of Yom Kippur? Okay, why don't we have 2 days of Yom Kippur? I remember growing up, everything needs a Washington story. I remember growing up, I had a friend, Uri Landisman. He lived in Woodside. His father still lives in Woodside. Uri Landisman. And I remember his mother telling us, as a little kid, but like this kind of struck me. His mother telling us that her father observed 2 days of Yom Kippur during the Holocaust. I was a kid. I had no idea what that meant. It took me 20 years to understand what that comment meant. But for some reason, I remembered that comment, and now I can explain to you what that comment meant. What that comment meant was that there were some Jews during the Holocaust, thank God, who were saved. They went to Japan, then they went to China. And depending on exactly where they were, they actually were on the other side of the international date line. And there's a question, this is also not for now, but fascinating. If you're on the other side of the international date line, means your Shabbos, when is your Shabbos? Is your Shabbos when they observe Saturday in Australia? Or is your Shabbos based on Shabbos in the Western Hemisphere? So that's a question. Nowadays, if there's so much travel, you can't operate having 2 days of Shabbos, right? Come on, imagine you go on a business trip and you lose 2 out of 7 days because you're observing Shabbos. It's not going to work that way. So today, everybody, when you go to Melbourne, you go to Sydney, you go to New Zealand, you go to Auckland, so you observe whatever day they observe of Shabbos. But in the Second World War, they never had this before. Right? No one had ever been to Japan and China before. These people came from Lithuania. They didn't know any of this stuff. So there were those people who actually observed 2 days of Yom Kippur. They observed 2 days of Shabbos every week. But this woman, Mrs. Landisman, she remembered only Yom Kippur. I don't blame her for remembering only Yom Kippur, right? Her father fasted for 2 days on Yom Kippur because there was a question with the international date line, whether or not their Shabbos was really Shabbos, or whether Shabbos was based on where it is in the Western Hemisphere. So therefore, they observed 2 days of Yom Kippur. Not she remember, and that is true. The yeshiva, the Mir yeshiva in Japan and then in Shanghai, actually they fasted for 2 days on Yom Kippur. Okay, but that's not related to us. I'm asking generally, why is it that we don't observe 2 days of Yom Kippur? We observe 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, and we observe 2 days of Sukkot. That means that on Rosh Hashanah, they weren't sure when Rosh Chodesh was. And on Sukkot, they weren't sure when Rosh Chodesh was. There's no way that in the middle, they figured out when Rosh Chodesh was. That's just not possible, right? Obviously, if they had a problem still on Sukkot, that means that there was a question when Rosh Chodesh was. And therefore they should have observed 2 days of Yom Kippur. So the Ramah in Shulchan Aruch writes that the reason we don't observe 2 days of Yom Kippur, and you all know the answer, right? The reason we don't observe 2 days of Yom Kippur is it's too hard to fast 2 days of Yom Kippur. You understand, Deborah, that to fast 2 days of Yom Kippur doesn't mean that you get to have a bowl of chicken soup in between, right? It's not like you daven the Elah the first day, and then you blow shofar, and then you have chicken soup, and then you do it all over again, like they do in Ramadan, where they fast and they eat at night. No, it wouldn't work that way. Because if we did the same way that today we observe Yontif, and tomorrow we observe Yontif, no, you're not breaking tomorrow night. It's not like between 8 and 9 o'clock tomorrow night, everybody's free to check your email. It doesn't work that way, right? It means you go from one day of Yontif to the other. That's the way it works. So if you had 2 days of Yom Kippur, you would have to observe 2 days straight of Yom Kippur. So the Ramah writes that that's not possible. Gzeira she'enat tzibur yechola lamod ba. It's a gzeira, means it would be a decree that the people couldn't handle. And because the people couldn't handle it, therefore we do not have 2 days of Yom Kippur. That idea that the rabbis did not institute a gzeira shein hatzibur yechola lamod ba, that the people could not handle is a fascinating thing, right? It means that the rabbis were very sensitive to what people could and could not do. And that also is very smart on the rabbis' part. For the rabbis to set up a situation which people couldn't handle, they're not accomplishing anything, right? To tell people to fast 2 days on Yom Kippur, and nobody can fast 2 days on Yom Kippur, what exactly are you going to accomplish, right? So that's interesting. I just want to pause for 1 second before I get to what I wanted to talk about. And I want to just see, Rabbi Herzfeld wrote a couple of things. Indeed, that's what we do for laning on Sukkot, right? We do the different days. That is correct. So why don't we have 2 days of Hanukkah? So I'll get to Hanukkah in 1 second. Oh my goodness. Okay, your grandmother fasted 2 days on Yom Kippur, maybe. And there's a mitzvah did on Yom Kippur, so we fast then a chumrah that lead to a kul. That's correct. We wouldn't fulfill that mitzvah. We'd have to. I don't know what we would do. We'd eat on the 8th or some crazy thing like that.
It's Ruth's grandmother who was in Shanghai, not mine.
Oh, Ruth's grandmother. Wow, that's amazing.
That's where my grandparents met.
That's amazing. So there are amazing stories about Shanghai. This is one story about Shanghai. So so you asked about Hanukkah and Purim. So why don't we observe 2 days of Hanukkah and 2 days of Purim? So that's also a good question. That's for the record. That's a good question, right? It's not a big deal to light an extra Hanukkah candle is not a big deal. So you might say, no, you're wrong, because you have the same problem with Hanukkah candles as you do with Sfiras Omer. What exactly you're going to do? Is everybody going to light 2 menorahs? That's what you'd have to do. You'd have to light on the first night of Hanukkah, you just have to light 1 menorah, because it's either the first night of Hanukkah or it's not Hanukkah yet. On the second night of Hanukkah, you'd have to light 2 menorahs. In one menorah, you'd light 2 candles in case it's the second night of Hanukkah. But in the other menorah, you'd light 1 candle. So practically speaking, now that's not impossible, Herzfeld. You know, we laugh about things. We always laugh about what we don't do. But I want to tell you, if somebody comes to Judaism and they've never seen Judaism before, they laugh at what we do. Right? Believe me, when they see you sitting on the steps of Olam Shalom, when they drive down 16th Street today at 3 o'clock in the morning, and they see you sitting on the steps of Olam Shalom, learning Torah, they're going to laugh, right? I mean, so the fact that, we don't do it is not necessarily a proof. So you could observe 2 days of Hanukkah. And for Purim, you definitely could observe 2 days of Purim. And Purim, actually, Rabbi Herzfeld, the kash is better, because Purim, we have a second day of Purim, right? We have Shushan Purim. It happens to be that we have it broken down so that some places observe the first day of Purim and places that are walled observe the second day of Purim. So in Yerushalayim, they observe the second day of Purim. But we have 2 days of Purim, so it would be a very big deal. This year, it happened to be that Purim was on Friday, so therefore the read the Megillah on Shabbos would have been a problem. But basically, there's no big deal to read the Megillah twice. We have 2 days of Purim. So the answer is, and here, it's a halachic answer. Again, that's what I talked about on Thursday night. My father doesn't like these kinds of answers, but I'll give it to you anyway. It's a kind of a halachic answer. The halachic answer is that in rabbinic law, they didn't make this institution. Only in biblical holidays did they add a second day of Yavneh, because biblical holidays, they're important, right? They're in the Torah. We want to make sure we get them right. But rabbinic holidays, they weren't so worried about, and therefore they didn't add an extra day for a rabbinic holiday. Now, that, I'll tell you, my father didn't like that answer. That answer is arbitrary. I mean, what does it mean? It's rabbinic, therefore they didn't care. I mean, sometimes they care about rabbinic laws. So therefore, that answer is not exactly tight. But I'm sorry to say that is the answer. And therefore, in rabbinic laws, that's the same way. We don't fast 2 days on Shivas B'Tammuz or whatever it is. I mean, one is enough, right? In rabbinic laws, 1 day is enough. We don't observe 2 days of Tu B'Shvat. We don't observe 2 days of, 2 days of Lag Bomer, though Lag Bomer would be the same issue. So that would be the same thing. So now let me just spend a couple of minutes now talking about the following. What is the mitzvah on Shavuos? And we just have just enough time to read something. And what I want to read to you is in itself fascinating. We know that there are 613 mitzvos, right? That actually relates to Shavuos. The Gemara in Makos teaches us, Torah tziva lanu Moshe, Morasha Kehilat Yaakov. Torah tziva lanu Moshe, Moshe commanded us the Torah. Says the Gemara, the gematria, the numerical value of the word Torah is 611. Moshe taught us 611 commandments, and God taught us 2 additional commandments. The first 2 commandments, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, it's stated in the first person. I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. And the second commandment, Lo Yelech Elohim Achim Al Panai, you cannot have another God. Those commandments the people heard directly from God. The people were nervous. The Torah says this. People were nervous. They needed because they're listening directly to God. So therefore, they asked Moshe to teach them the rest. Torah Tzivalanu Moshe. Moshe taught us 611, and God taught us the last 2. There are 613 mitzvahs. Now that's what Gemara teaches us. What the Gemara doesn't teach us is what are the 613 mitzvahs, and that was a huge debate in the centuries post Gemara, what we call the Gaonic period, the 800s, the 900s, the 1000s. And there were big debates. A lot of people had debates, and it had to do with complicated issues with the Karaites. There were a lot of big debates. In the 1100s, the Rambam was born. The Rambam was born in 1135, died in 1204. The Rambam actually compiled a list of the 613 mitzvahs. Because the Rambam was who the Rambam was, once the Rambam compiled the list of 613 mitzvahs, his mitzvahs became the mitzvahs. Those were the mitzvahs. And those were the 613 mitzvahs. So therefore, I can show you other counts, other lists of mitzvahs. But if you were to be asked today, what are the 613 mitzvahs, the go-to book would be the Rambam's list of mitzvahs. And again, it has to do with the status of Rambam. Rambam was Rambam. And therefore, they accepted his 613 mitzvahs. What's interesting is that Ramban, there's Rambam and there's Ramban. Ramban was Nachmanides, Moshe ben Nachman. He lived in the 1200s, about 75 years after the Rambam, from a different world. He lived in Catalonia. He lived in Christian Spain. The Rambam lived in Muslim countries. The Ramban lived in Christian Spain. He was very important in Christian Spain. The Ramban was also a great intellect, a great leader. There just was a book written by Moshe Halbertal on the Ramban. Very, very interesting. The Ramban, believe it or not, as an appendix to the Rambam's list of mitzvos, the Ramban lists mitzvos sheshachach harav b'mitzvos lo sase. He lists certain commandments that the Rambam forgot. The whole thing sounds crazy. What do you mean the Rambam forgot it? It meant that the Ramban had a slightly different count of the mitzvos. Mitzvos sheshachach harav. And he lists the mitzvos. The second mitzvah that the Ramban lists, mitzvos sheshachach harav, that the Rambam forgot, shenimneu shelo nishkach ma'amad har Sinai. The second commandment, a lo taseh, lest you do this, don't do this. Don't forget the day that God gave the Torah on Mount Sinai. V'lo nasiro tomi datenu, and don't let it ever leave our conscience. Aval yiyu einenu b'libeinu sham kol hayomim. We have to think about the revelation, the kolotu brakim, the thunder and the lightning, the fact that God spoke to the people. You have to think about it all the time. The pasuk says in Devarim, be careful, lest you forget the things that your eyes saw. Says the Ramban that one of the 613 mitzvos is not to forget the experience of revelation, not the 10 commandments. You can't forget the 10 commandments because you can't forget the law. You have to follow the law. But you have to remember the experience of revelation. Now that, according to Ramban, happens to be the mitzvah of Shavuos. How do I know it's the mitzvah of Shavuos? Because we have a general rule that forgetting, how long does it take to forget something? That's a good question. How long does it take to forget something? The answer is, says the Gemara, it takes a year to forget something. How do I know that? I know that because there's a mitzvah of Parsha Zachar. I have to remember, Zachar es asher asalacha Amalek. Remember what Amalek. How often do we recite those psukim? Once a year. The Gemara says that people can remember things for a year, but they can't remember things for longer than a year. Okay, you can do some research and see whether that's right or not. Doesn't matter. If the Gemara says it, it means that our system is based on that. And therefore, the Ramban says that the reason that tomorrow we will read the story of Ma'amad Har Sinai is to fulfill this mitzvah, or not to violate this mitzvah. Shelo nishkach Ma'amad Har Sinai v'lo nasir oto midateinu. That we won't forget the mitzvah of Har Sinai. That's once a year that we have to remember the mitzvah of Har Sinai. The Mishnah Berurah writes, it's interesting, we always stand when you read the Ten Commandments. Rabbi Soloveitchik thought that you only stand when you read the Ten Commandments on Shavuos, not when you read the Ten Commandments in the yearly cycle. Because in the yearly cycle, it's just part of the Torah. But tomorrow, it's Ma'amad Har Sinai. That's what the Ramban says. We remember the revelation. And just like the Jews stood at the foot of Mount Sinai, so too we stand tomorrow. That's exactly what he says. Sho nishkach Ma'amad Har Sinai. And that's why we read it that way. And that's also, by the way, Mishnah Berurah says, those people who are Torah readers, there are two ways to read the Ten Commandments. Something called Tamelion and Tamtachton. Tamtachton is just the usual musical notes, the usual trup. Tamelion is a special trup, a special set of musical notes that's used only for the Ten Commandments. It's special because it divides the commandments not by verses, not by psukim, but rather by commandments. Divides them as 10 commandments. And the Mishnah Berurah says that when we read the Torah, when we read the 10 commandments during the year, we use tamtachton. We divide them as psukim, like we always do. But on Shavuos, we divide them as commandments, tamelion. We read it differently. We read it as tamelion. Again, that's also not our custom. Our custom is always to read it with tamelion. But that's what the Mishnah Berurah writes. Shenimnu shelo nishkach Ma'amad Har Sinai. You can't forget Har Sinai. The question is, in about the 7 minutes we have left, is it's all very nice. That's a nice Dvar Torah. Okay, my father would say that's a nice Dvar Torah. The problem is, what happened to the Rambam? The Rambam forgot that mitzvah. I promise you one thing. The Rambam did not forget the experience of revelation on Har Sinai. He didn't forget it. I promise you. I don't know what he was thinking about, but he always thought about the revelation on Mount Sinai. So what does it mean? The Ramban says the mitzvah that the Rambam forgot. He didn't forget it. So what's it mean? So actually, if you look in the Rambam in the Sefer HaMitzvos, he is right. 613 mitzvos, remembering Ma'amad Har Sinai doesn't appear. If you look in his Mishnah Torah, his encyclopedia, the mitzvah Ma'amad Har Sinai doesn't appear. There's a book. Again, I told you, my father would always show you the book. The Igros HaRambam, the letters of the Rambam. In 1171, the Rambam wrote a letter to the scholars in Yemen. Today we think Yemen, it's literally, there can't be any place further on planet Earth. But Yemen was an extremely important Jewish community. And they communicated with the Rambam. The Rambam respected the scholars in Yemen. And the scholars in Yemen wrote to the Rambam because there seemed to be someone who was a false messiah. He claimed that the correct religion was some kind of combination between Judaism and Islam. And they wrote to the Rambam. They said, what are we supposed to do? Like, what are we supposed to tell the people? Like, how do we convince the people that our Judaism is the real Judaism and this pseudo-messiah is an imposter? That was the question they asked the Rambam. The Rambam wrote back a very, very famous letter. I mean, it's kind of obscure because you can't find it in many books, but it's a real letter. And he basically used this as an excuse to talk about what Judaism was about, right? They asked him, how do we define Judaism? This guy's an imposter. How do we define Judaism? So he writes about what Judaism is. And one of the things he talks about in Judaism, he says, V'zichru Ma'amad Har Sinai. and remember the experience of Har Sinai. Asher tzivanu Hashem l'zachro tamid, that God commanded us to remember all the time. V'hizhiranu mishakcho, and God says, don't forget it. V'tzivanu lo diaso levaneinu ad sheyigdalu al yudiaso. He says exactly what you'd want him to say. You're not allowed to forget the experience of Har Sinai. I don't understand. The Ramban says that this is one of the mitzvos the Rambam missed, and he adds it. The Rambam doesn't include it in his 613. But here in this obscure letter, Igeret Teiman, to the scholars of Teiman, of Yemen, he says, V'zichru mamar Har Sinai, asher tzivanu Hashem l'zachro tamid, v'hizhiranu mishakcho. He says you can't forget it. So if you can't forget it, why doesn't he list it in 613? That is a commandment. You're not allowed to forget mamar Har Sinai. Why did he list it? Why doesn't he list it in the 613? And the answer is the following. The answer is that according to Ramban, not forgetting the experience of Har Sinai is its own mitzvah. You're not allowed to forget mamar Har Sinai. The Rambam says, no, that's silly. Not to forget mamar Har Sinai, that's correct. You're not allowed to forget the experience of revelation, of receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai. But that's not its own mitzvah. That's part of what it means to believe in God. Believing in God means that I believe in God, and I believe in God, that God is the one who took the Jews to the foot of Mount Sinai, however many years ago, tomorrow morning on the 6th day of Sivan. And he gave us the Torah. And we can't forget that. We have to think about it all the time, but not as its own mitzvah. That's one piece of the mitzvah belief in God. The mitzvah belief in God has a lot of different pieces to it. One of it is to believe that God gave us the Torah, and that the experience of giving us the Torah was with all the drama, with all the thunder and lightning and all the excitement of the mitzvah. And that's so Rambamish. The Rambam understood, he was able to conceptualize things. Means you say there's a mitzvah not to forget Har Sinai, but he says, what do you mean there's a mitzvah? It's not a mitzvah by itself. What kind of mitzvah by itself is it? It's part of the mitzvah to believe in God. Believing that God gave the Torah is part of the mitzvah to believe in God. That's not a separate one of the 613. That's the very first one of the 613. And everything is based on that. And this is part of that mitzvah. So actually, the Ramban says that the Rambam forgot this mitzvah. No. The Rambam didn't forget this mitzvah. The Rambam knew it. I don't know if the Ramban knew the Igeret Teiman or he didn't know the Igeret Teiman. That wasn't the point. The point is the Rambam knew this mitzvah. The Rambam just categorized it differently than the Ramban. And sometimes it's just in how you categorize it. But tomorrow morning, we are going to fulfill this mitzvah. According to the Ramban, as we read the Torah, as we stand up as they read the 10 Commandments, we will fulfill a separate mitzvah of the 613 mitzvos of remembering mamar Har Sinai, the receiving of the Torah, the revelation on Mount Sinai. According to the Rambam, we will be fulfilling a mitzvah which is part of our belief in God. And that is that a big piece of belief in God is believing that God gave us the Torah the way that God gave it. The Rambam and the Ramban, two views of what Shavuos is, what revelation was about, what the idea of revelation is in the big picture of Judaism. May we all be able to celebrate the holiday of Shavuot together. May we all fulfill the mitzvah of remembering the experience of receiving the Torah on Mount Sinai. And may we all remember the fact that there are different ways of understanding that mitzvah. Is it a separate mitzvah? Is it part of emunah? But this is all part of the conversation about what Jewish law, Jewish ritual, and Jewish tradition is all about. And please God, we should be able, in memory of my father, who loved the conversation. That's what Deborah said at the beginning. What do you think? Who loved the conversation? That's a big part of the revelation, is the ability to continue the conversation. May we be able all to continue that conversation for many years to come. Chag Sameach, Agud Yad.
And Rabbi Mintz, just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing, and just to say a word about your father. You know, there's so much we could say and we should say, but just about this specific day, I remember many times, more than 10 times, Shavuos night meant Rabbi Ben Mintz giving us our shiur. He would talk to us and give us a shiur, and every year was different. And he would pull out his like notes on his legal pad, and he would talk, and we would be mesmerized. And that's what Torah is. Really, Shavuos is about the giving of the Torah, and Torah was hearing Rabbi Ben Mintz sharing new things every year on Shavuos night. It was just like we felt we were at Sinai. We felt we were at Sinai hearing him. And when you speak, I hear him also. I do hear your father and your tone and your accent and your brilliance. So it's very meaningful to me that we begin our holiday this year with Torah from the Mintz family, and remembering our dear teacher, Rabbi Ben Mintz. So thank you, Rabbi Adam Mintz.
Thank you, Rabbi Shmuel, Maharat Ruth, and Chag Sameach to everybody. Be well.